You are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report magazine. My name is Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the pod. Head to theafricareport.com for our latest reporting on the coronavirus, on the death of Burundi's President Nkurunziza, and our latest series on how Nigeria's economy will handle the impact of COVID-19. The impact of the virus underpins today's conversation with the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. His Institute for Global Change works with 14 governments across Africa, offering advice on restructuring civil services, reorienting economies, and, as the Institute puts it, aims to make globalization work. Globalization has been under attack for some time now, not just from the coronavirus, but from the various forms of nationalism, economic and otherwise, that have multiplied since the 2009 economic crash. Brexit, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, the US-China trade war, all symptoms of a world that is chafing under the current set of international agreements. We talk about this, but we start with the economic impact of the virus on the continent. I'm joined in this conversation by my colleague Remy Darras.
Yeah, so the Institute basically, we've completely pivoted towards COVID and dealing with COVID and the other issues associated with it. But the big dilemma for Africa is how to ensure that the cure isn't worse than the disease. So we are engaged in two things at the moment: trying to advise our governments as to what basic measures they need to take in relation to COVID-19, how to stop the spread, how to do sufficient testing, how to make sure their frontline healthcare workers are properly protected, but at the same time, working on plans to reopen the economy, because otherwise the economic and social and indeed health damage of COVID is going to be worse than the actual disease itself. So many of the economies are informal economies, and people don't work, they don't eat, food supply chains get disrupted. We'll have a big increase in food insecurity, which will be life-threatening in many cases. And then there are immunization programs and health programs, HIV, AIDS, malaria, so on, which will be disrupted. So really what we're trying to do is to create a situation in which we manage to resolve Africa's dilemma by doing what has to be done in respect of the disease, but doing it in a way that minimizes the collateral damage to the economy and society and healthcare.
There were, trends even before the coronavirus got started of, greater economic nationalism. You're sitting in the UK, I don't need to tell you about that. But there's also concerns now with the coronavirus that there will be more redomestication of manufacturing chains, for example. Can African countries bank on export-driven growth in the way the Asian tigers did? Or are they going to be hurt by this trend? So, for example, will Ethiopia still be able to push ahead with these big textile industrial parks?
So that's a tough question. It's not clear what the answer is, because I think there may be a desire on the part of countries to repatriate bits of their supply chain. But it's not clear to me that will go very much beyond health and ancillary activities. So I still think there's a future for Africa as an exporter of goods. And in the work we do, because part of the work we do is bring investment into African countries. And we haven't noticed yet, at any rate, a diminution of appetite for people to come in and to invest, with a view also to an export market. And then some of the produce, so some of the basic commodities, are to be found in Africa at a scale which is going to require export in any event. I think the big challenge for Africa is really around how they add value to whatever they're producing. And it's that sort of addressing, making sure that your finished products are keeping the value in Africa to be really important. And I think one thing I've noticed in all the conversations I've had with African presidents and prime ministers is there's a real sense that what COVID has done is expose for them the urgency of institutional and government reform. They need to be capable of building resilient healthcare systems, improving education, making sure that the environment for business and industry, and there's an overwhelming sense, which began before COVID, but I think is now even more clear now, of Africa wanting to take its destiny into its own hands, to be much less reliant on aid and dependent from outside. I think Africa in these last months has got taught a sharp lesson in the problem of global supply chains itself, scrabbling around to try and get equipment brought into Africa, PPE and ventilators. And I also think there's a real sense of Africa starting to get its act together. I mean, the way that people have come together to create the purchasing platform for basic COVID equipment has been quite impressive, actually. So my theory of COVID and its political impact, all the trends that were there prior to COVID are there after it, but intensified and accelerated.
There have been calls for moratoria on African debt. Others think it's perhaps up to the IMF and others to provide some kind of a fiscal backstop so that the risk profile of African countries is not affected. Where do you fall between these two options?
My view in the short term is that Africa should access all the help it can get on debt relief, and not just postponing it, but trying to relieve that debt burden, which is still immense for many African countries, and in making sure, for example, that the IMF and the World Bank is helping in the way they can. And so, my advice to the governments we work with is do everything you can, obviously, to access that help. But our focus as an institute is on long-term economic construction and improvement. Because in the end, the work that we do is that I believe with good governance and proper political leadership, Africa can end its dependence on aid and assistance. It's never a healthy, ultimately it's not a long-term as a sort of donor-recipient relationship. And again, the new generation of leaders in Africa, they want their countries to be on their own 2 feet. Now, in the short term, there's help that's necessary and we should access as much as we can. It's agnostic as to the right way to do that. You can do it through debt restructuring, debt relief, IMF programs, and so on. But in the medium and long term, the aim should be to generate economic wealth from within.
Should Chinese creditors be more flexible on payment schedules?
I mean, China's obviously a major creditor. And yes, of course, I'd like to see China play its part as well. I mean, I think China will, incidentally, if it's on the same terms as other countries. But then you've got commercial debt as well, which is also difficult. But no, sure, of course, and we are pressing for. I mean, the G20's already done a certain amount on this, but we need to do more. And then, by the way, there's a whole other challenge, which is to make sure that whatever vaccine emerges as a vaccine that is likely to work, we need to make sure it can be manufactured and distributed in Africa.
You have regular discussions with Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of WHO. He has been accused of being overly influenced by China. Is that fair?
I think the WHO is being treated unfairly at the moment. First of all, it's in its nature that it has to pay attention to the big political, contributors. And you can't really expect a UN body not to do that. And secondly, I will say about the WHO, accusing them of not being able to handle this pandemic in the right way is like accusing a football club in League One, if you're familiar with the English Football League, accusing a team in League One of not winning the Champions League. Well, it's never going to happen. So the truth is that they are organized and structured in such a way that it's not reasonable to expect them to handle a unique global pandemic of this nature. Now, in the medium and long term, again, I think there is a necessity to recast the WHO, and I think people within the WHO would accept that. You're going to have to make it build it into a much more effective body. But to criticize them at the moment, I think is counterproductive. And for the work that I see the WHO doing and the work we do in partnership with them, I mean, they're working flat out to try and help people.
Both the commercial debt question that you alluded to and this question of the WHO, it does point to a lacuna perhaps in the international architecture of decision making. A lot of these institutions were birthed after the Second World War. How can the WHO and others, Bretton Woods included, how can they be recast, especially given this new power calculus in the world today with a much more influential Asia?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's very difficult to answer it, because the trouble, for those of us who've been around the international institutions for some time, the problem is they're constituted in a particular way that means to change them, you need consensus. And in circumstances where the world is, I think, at risk of breaking into blocks now, it's very hard to achieve that consensus. So if you take the UN Security Council, if you were setting up the UN Security Council today, would you set it up in its present form? I mean, obviously not. So likewise with the governance of the major institutions. And you can apply that to the WHO as well. So it's very difficult, because plainly you need at a certain point to get to that deep reform. But in the meantime, you've got to make the existing architecture work. And really, I think the only thing that works at the moment is probably the G20 as a forcing body for change, because you've got at least the main countries sat round the table. I mean, even the G7 now, which in my time was a powerful body, is obviously missing some of the key international players. And one of the big challenges for Africa in the future, it's why I'm a passionate believer that the Africa Union's got to become a more powerful body in the end. It will start to become very difficult for individual African countries to navigate the America-China relationship. And this is going to become an increasing, already I'm constantly asked for advice about this, because it's going to get more and more difficult. So again, the trend of that America-China, confrontation, I think you'd have to call it, was building before COVID, but is now, that's an example of a trend that's accelerated and intensified. So so Africa's going to have to build its own strong capabilities, really, in order to represent Africa at the top table. So your top table, I always say to people about politics at this geopolitical level it's actually far less complicated than you think. It's really very simple. Power is power. Okay. So at the top table, you will have America, you will have China, because these are two major superpowers. You may, in time, probably will, I think, have India because of population and size. Then the question is, can Europe get its act together? Then if Europe can get its act together, can other regional blocs get their act together? Because it's only collectively you're going to sit at that top table, realistically. And that's why, in the future, it's going to be very important that Africa tries to find on certain key questions one voice, because it'll be much more powerful if it does that. Even though obviously countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia, because of size, are going to be key players, but they're still going to be medium-sized in the grand scheme of things if you've got these giants like USA, China, India.
Is it difficult for the UK government to offer advice on this? Because it has been a champion of things like the African Free Trade Area, Continental Free Trade Area, but at the same time, it's obviously removing itself from the European Union. So it makes it hard for a single message to get through.